First of all, thank you to Katie for hosting this session. I am really excited to be presenting here with a bunch of other really wonderful speakers. But yeah, my name is Lily Houtman. I am a second-year master's student at Penn State, and today I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results and kind of musings, more so than results, from my master's thesis, which is on mobile thematic map design, specifically in the context of data journalism. So first, I kind of want to define the three aspects of my research of what is a mobile thematic map. And so first, it is a map that is consumed on a mobile device. And of course, a lot of our research so far in cartography on mobile maps has really been on navigation and reference maps, less so on thematic maps. So that's why I'm really focusing on thematic maps, because of course, some of those design considerations for navigation maps can apply to thematic maps. But there's a lot of opportunity for like user-centered maps in navigation. You can zoom in and out, you can have multiple scales in a way that isn't always possible for thematic maps. A lot of times they end up being static maps. So there are some differences when it comes to thematic maps. And I am specifically researching the subject in the context of data journalism, just because that is really one of the main ways the public is going to encounter mobile thematic maps, and so that is where I am centering my research. So what I began for my master's research, which is kind of looking at the past, present, and possible future of mobile thematic map design, was I began with a lit review, just to kind of draw out some major themes that are specific to the intersection of these three areas. And so the first is responsive design, right? Because there are some mobile maps that really only have to be viewed on mobile devices, but news maps are something where you really do have to design for desktop as well. Even though most people are consuming on mobile, plenty of people do still consume on desktop. Second, of course, there's screen constraints for mobile devices, so some of that is like size and orientation, although some of that computing power of a mobile device is kind of a constraint of that as well. I say generalization and complexity just because sometimes we have to reduce that information or maybe display it a different way for mobile, even if it's not a reduction, again, in relation to this smaller screen size. And then post-WIMP environments is an academic term that is standing for Windows, icons, mouse, and pointer. So this is kind of referring to the fact that on a big desktop, you can use your mouse, you can have multiple windows, things like that. And that's not necessarily an advantage over mobile, because mobile has options for like AR and VR that a desktop can't necessarily do. So it's not a disadvantage either way, it's just a difference that you have to design for. Next is technical accessibility. So this is getting back to the computing power of mobile devices a little bit. Obviously, our phones are pretty powerful these days, but they're still not quite as strong as some computers are. And in thinking about this, we do have to remember that on mobile devices, people are consuming news maps in more environments. Maybe they're on the subway on the way to work, or they're walking outside in bright sunlight. So we have to think about who is able to read these maps. And then finally, individual accessibility. There was a really great accessibility panel this morning, and just kind of remembering to practice inclusive design. If you're designing for these broad audiences, you want everyone to be able to read those with sight differences, limb differences, any reason that someone might have challenges or difficulties reading a map if you don't design for them. But the lit review is not my favorite part of my research. My favorite part is actually getting to talk with the people who are practicing this day to day and who are actually news cartographers and data journalists who get to go out and make these maps for public consumption. So really, I want to credit all these 18 wonderful people, many of whom are attendees at NACIS, who agreed to spend 75 minutes each with me to chat about how they currently and how they might in the future design mobile news maps. And so today I'm going to be presenting some results from those interviews and also showing some of the wireframes that I asked them to do that are mostly looking towards the future of mobile map design, but I'm going to use them as examples of kind of what they're currently doing as well. And I will also say that right now, I am not going to tie any image to any specific person just because some people did request that their names not be tied to that. That being said, if you're in the room and you drew one of the ones that appears on the screen and you want to be like, hey, that's me, feel free to say it in like the Slack or something, because I want you to be able to have credit for your work if you choose to acknowledge that that is yours that you drew. But basically, I'm going to talk about 5 major areas of the current practice of mobile news map design. But first, I want to have a brief interlude because these were interviews. I had software that had to transcribe my interviews. It did so automatically, and it doesn't really know the word choropleth. I mean, it doesn't give it like a red underline or anything, but it does not know choropleth. And so we have a lot of weird things. I like kloop right at the end there. I don't really know what that is. And most of these are also not real words, which is kind of funny. Like getting like the chloroplast, like, okay, that's actually a real word, but yeah, some of these just very silly and kind of fun for me to collect them as I was looking at the interview transcripts. But to go on to some of the actual results of what are people doing right now to design mobile news maps. Well, one of the first things and one of the most obvious things is just like a map, especially of like the world or the United States, is typically landscape oriented. So how do you deal with things like that? Many people are rotating maps, which might have varying success with users, and also depending on the area, you might have to rotate up to 90 degrees, but it might be just a little bit turned depending on the map. Globes are really interesting and like basically an azimuthal projection for worldwide phenomenon. So rather than like a landscape world map, you might stack a few globes on top of each other, which I think works well because then on desktop they can be like 1, 2, 3, and on mobile they can be down. Another way is splitting whatever you're mapping, such as the United States, in half or into thirds and then stacking those. Although that creates an interesting question of do you put the East Coast or the West Coast first? I don't really know. Another option is to switch to a chart on mobile when it might be a map on desktop, although that kind of creates an interesting question of like, if it can be a chart on mobile, why does it need to be a map on desktop? So that's like could go either way. And then another one that's a little bit harder to describe is just allowing people to kind of like pan to different sections as they're scrolling. So it would basically be like you're scrolling and then it shows you one part of the map and it kind of moves you left and right even though you're scrolling up and down. So people are coming up with a lot of creative options for this, which is great to see. And another thing that I was really curious about then was map type, because I thought maybe people would say, oh, this map type is like really good on mobile and this type is really bad. But people were like, you know, not really. You can't have like a holistic good or bad. It really depends on the data and the scale of that data. So it's like choropleths aren't always like good or bad. It just depends on the subject. Like that's really an overarching theme of this research, is that it really depends on the data of what works and what doesn't. Every map is a different problem. And so this is the beginning of some of my examples. This one is kind of like a box tile grid of the US that has been rotated 90 degrees. So I thought that this was just like a cool way to maybe approach things, because then you have your 3 data categories and you have like a little line chart on each state. Next, what I found really interesting was how to approach the question of simplicity, because I thought maybe people would be using slightly different data on desktop or mobile, but when you're designing maps in a journalism setting, you're designing for a very broad audience. You're not designing for scientists. So you kind of are reducing the data down to its essential parts already. And so you don't want to make a lot of differences between desktop and mobile. And you also don't want to give the users different experiences across different devices. And so you can't really change the data across things. But this data reduction, in addition to being for broad audiences, makes sense because of how users may interact with maps on mobile. They may read them faster or in more distracted environments. And so this is helpful in making sure that they understand the key picture of the map. So when it comes to places where there can be more differences between desktop and mobile, design is really the key area. So fewer labels, maybe removing the terrain, cropping out the little sides of the map. If on desktop you show a little extra information that you don't really need, you could crop that for mobile. So design is where people are getting creative more so than data, which I found interesting. And so this map, I think, is a good example where at the beginning it's only 3 classes, so that way it's easier to just have your eye jump to one of those 3 classes rather than a more continuous scheme. And then the second map on the side keys the reader into the area they should care the most about. So rather than showing them just the entire country and expecting them to get the main picture, to zoom into the area where the data is most extreme, for example. Next, I really find data journalists' interactions with interactivity really interesting because increasingly, and there have been previous talks on this in different areas, that interactivity is increasingly being used in limited ways in data journalism because it's a question of like, are users interacting with this? Are they actually using it when it appears there? But then issues of like touch on mobile versus hover on desktop are smaller if there's less interactivity. So really the question is, do users want interactivity? And a great example that I think shows where interactivity could exist is here's one of those maps where as you scroll, it jumps to different sections, different areas of the country. And so as a result of that, the only interaction is just scrolling, which people are already doing when they're reading a news story. So in a user-centered design then, when does it make sense to have interactivity is if it's egocentric. So if people can say, what did people vote for in my county? Or how is COVID happening in my area? That's a case where interactivity does make sense because people actually want to interact then. But really an overarching theme is it's difficult as news cartographers to understand how users are actually interacting. That's not a type of data that gets collected a lot at news organizations, and so there's kind of this user-based question. And again, just mentioning accessibility, you want to design for all kinds of users so that way more of them can experience and interact with the story, which many people are doing a good job of. So this is a great example where you could perhaps have kind of a magnifying glass onto the area that you care about. You like put your finger over that and it will zoom in that area so you can read it a little bit better. Or if people are struggling with that, just picking your county, which many people are already doing in their maps. And then finally, I was just a little interested in design process because people are kind of mixed in whether they're having mobile first or desktop first design. Some people are starting one way, some people are starting the other way, and both seem to work pretty well. So I was expecting more cohesion towards mobile first, but there is kind of a mix, which I found interesting, and it seems to work. And what's really cool is people are drawing from a lot of different sources, from historical maps and printed maps when they're designing for mobile. So I really like this example over on the right, imagining the California wildfires as like a burnt napkin on the map. I thought was just like really cool and a non-traditional way to do things. And I just wanted to point out a few other quick examples. So this one, the 3 on the right, kind of put each state in a chart kind of way, and you scroll through from most extreme to least extreme. This one allows users to submit their own data at the very bottom. And this one, depending on which area you select, the natural disaster that's most relevant to that area will be selected. So in this area of the country, it would be hurricanes, but elsewhere it might be extreme heat. So finally, what is really the overarching theme is data journalists have a lot of really cool solutions, but there's kind of a lack of data on how users are actually interacting with these maps. So that's going to lead into my future PhD research, but I also just want to say that if you see a news map that works really well or maybe doesn't work very well, feel free to reach out to the amazing news cartographers, many whom are here at NACIS, and tell them what you like and don't like, because that's not often a type of feedback that's happening in data journalism. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lily. Yeah. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Does anybody have any questions?
I'm curious if anyone was like prompting the user to rotate their phone into portrait or landscape?
Yeah, so I didn't specifically hear of anyone mentioning that. That was kind of something I was thinking about as well and wondering if people would mention, but I think it really comes down to, again, people are interacting and interacting really fast, reading these stories really fast. So if they're already not often interacting, even with a simple tap on a map, it can be a little hard to get people to turn their phones. I think that is a possible solution. And in future user tests that I do, I might try to ask people to do that and see if they're actually willing to do something like that.
Any other questions from the group? Yes, Joanna.
Yeah, I was curious, I'm not sure if you asked, but do you know if many are tracking interaction, like hit rates, or, and if
Yeah.
they'll share that with you?
Yeah, so basically the conclusions that I got from people so far is that a lot of people know that that's happening like somewhere in their news organization, but they don't necessarily receive the specific feedback on it. I mean, these are a lot of really large organizations, so people don't always get exactly data. A lot of times people do hear like, oh, this story is doing really well, so we'll like push it on social media and stuff like that. But that would be something that I'm like interested in asking people for that data in the future. And if a lot of news organizations give it to me, I think that's really interesting to report. But if I'm only getting it from like one or two, then I don't know if that's quite as useful, but could still be interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lily.